Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know how much we love to break down powerful strategies, and that's exactly what we're doing today. We're going to be diving into one of the most effective and honestly one of the most fascinating from Robert Greene's The 33 Strategies of War.
Yeah, uh it's a good one.
It is a good one. It's all about how to break down challenges and overcome obstacles, but not by brute force, not by sheer willpower,
Right.
by using strategy.
By outsmarting them.
By outsmarting them, exactly. And this is strategy number 17. Defeat them in detail, the divide and conquer strategy. Which, when you just hear the name, it's pretty self-explanatory, right?
Yeah, I mean, it does kind of give away the game right there in the title.
Yeah, but there's a lot more to it than just the simple phrase divide and conquer.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a lot of nuance to it. It's not just about breaking things up. It's about understanding why that's so effective and then applying it strategically. So, it's not just about brute force division. It's really about finesse and calculation.
Yeah, and it applies to so many different areas of life. I mean, we're talking about war strategies, but Robert Greene really breaks down how this applies to business, to personal relationships,
Yeah.
really any situation where you're facing some kind of opposition.
Yeah, you're going up against any obstacle.
Exactly. And so in this deep dive, we're going to do a few things. We're going to unpack why the strategy is so effective. We're going to look at a couple of really compelling historical examples to illustrate the strategy in action.
So we've got some great stories for you guys today.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is like a history buff's dream episode.
Oh, sure.
And then we're going to discuss some practical ways that you can apply this in your own life. Because again, this isn't just about, military history. This is about how to be more strategic in any area of your life.
Absolutely. So, like we always do, we're going to try to give you those concrete takeaways that you can put into action today.
Exactly. So let's start by really defining what we mean by divide and conquer.
All right, so at its core, this strategy is about recognizing that a unified enemy or a unified obstacle is much harder to overcome than one that's been broken down into smaller, more manageable parts.
Right. So it's like, think about it like a big solid boulder. It's really hard to break that boulder with just like one swing of a hammer.
Right. It's going to take a lot of effort.
A lot of effort, yeah. But if you can somehow find those cracks in the boulder, those natural fissures, and you can start to wedge those apart, eventually that whole thing is going to crumble.
Exactly. And that's what this strategy is all about. It's about finding those weak points, those natural divisions within your opponent, and then exploiting them.
And the beauty of it is that when you divide your opponent, you're not just weakening them physically or, in a literal sense, you're also weakening their morale, their resolve.
Right. You're taking away their sense of unity, their sense of shared purpose.
Exactly, because when they're all fighting amongst themselves,
They're distracted.
they're distracted. They're not focusing on you.
That's right. They're too busy worrying about each other to mount a coordinated defense against you.
Exactly. And so Greene, in the book, he actually lays out three main principles of this strategy. And I think it's really helpful to kind of break it down into those principles.
Okay, yeah, let's hear them.
Okay, so the first principle is that when you divide your enemy, you weaken their resistance. It's a lot harder for them to stand up to you when they're not unified.
It's like if you have a bunch of sticks together,
Yeah.
it's hard to break them, right? But if you separate those sticks out,
One at a time.
one by one, yeah, much easier to snap them. Same principle applies here.
It's so true. And the second principle is that when you divide your enemy, you create opportunities for easier victories. So instead of having to fight one big, huge battle, you're fighting a series of smaller, more manageable battles that you're much more likely to win.
You're picking your battles, you're choosing where to focus your energy and resources, which gives you a huge strategic advantage.
Exactly. And then the third principle is that when you divide your enemy, you gain greater control over the situation. Because, again, they're so busy fighting amongst themselves that they're not really able to focus on countering your moves.
Right. It's like you're playing chess and you've managed to get your opponent's pieces all scattered and disorganized.
They can't coordinate a good attack.
Exactly. They can't mount a coordinated attack, so you have much more freedom to make your moves and dictate the pace of the game.
So those are the three principles. I mean, it's really kind of straightforward when you break it down like that, but putting it into practice can be a little bit trickier.
Right. Well, that's where the historical examples come in handy.
Mm-hmm.
So, we always talk about how history is the best teacher.
The best teacher.
So let's look at some examples of how this strategy has been used successfully in the past.
Okay, so the first example, and this is one that Greene really goes into detail on, is Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul.
Ah, Caesar. Classic example of a master strategist.
Classic. So for those who need a little refresher, Gaul was basically what we now know as France and some surrounding areas.
Right.
And it was inhabited by these different Gaelic tribes. And these tribes, they weren't really unified.
No, they were often at odds with each other, vying for territory, resources, all those classic drivers of conflict.
And Caesar, he recognized this immediately. He saw that these tribes were a much bigger threat if they were united.
So instead of trying to conquer them all at once, he adopted a much more clever approach.
Very clever. I mean, this is Caesar we're talking about. So he starts by making alliances with certain tribes, promising them protection, offering them trade deals.
Yeah, classic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend strategy.
Exactly. And then he would use those alliances to turn those tribes against their rivals.
So he's essentially pitting them against each other, keeping them distracted and preventing them from uniting against him.
And it worked brilliantly. I mean, he was able to conquer Gaul piece by piece over a period of several years.
Yeah, and in the process, he really solidified his reputation as one of the greatest military commanders in history.
I mean, it's like a masterclass in divide and conquer. He didn't just defeat these tribes, he outmaneuvered them, outthought them. And that's the real power of this strategy. It's not just about brute force.
No, it's about intelligence. It's about understanding your opponent, understanding their motivations, their weaknesses, and then using that knowledge to your advantage.
And this strategy is not just limited to military campaigns. I mean, it's been used successfully in all sorts of contexts throughout history and even today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned business earlier. There are tons of examples of how businesses use this strategy to outcompete their rivals.
Yeah, like think about how companies will sometimes engage in price wars.
Right, they'll slash prices on certain products to undercut specific competitors, trying to drive them out of business or at least weaken them significantly.
Exactly, and then they can swoop in and take over that market share. Or how about targeted marketing campaigns?
Oh, yeah, where companies will focus their advertising efforts on specific demographics or customer segments that they know are particularly vulnerable to their message.
Exactly, and so they're dividing the market, essentially, creating little niches that they can dominate.
Right, instead of trying to appeal to everyone, they're focusing on winning over smaller, more defined groups.
Which makes a lot of sense because it's a lot easier to tailor your message and your product to a specific group than it is to try and be everything to everyone.
Exactly. And speaking of tailored messages, let's not forget about the world of politics. I mean, politicians are masters of this strategy.
Oh, yeah, they wrote the book on it.
Right. They're constantly looking for ways to divide the electorate, to pit different groups against each other in order to gain or maintain power.
They will highlight those wedge issues, those hot-button topics that they know will stir up controversy and create division.
Right. And the goal there isn't necessarily to solve those issues. It's to exploit them, to use them to their advantage by getting people so focused on those divisive issues that they lose sight of the bigger picture.
I mean, it's cynical, but it's effective. And it's a reminder that this strategy, it can be used for good or for bad. It really depends on the intentions of the person wielding it.
Yeah, it's a tool, like any tool. It can be used for constructive purposes or destructive purposes.
Exactly. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about a more modern business example, which is Amazon.
Ah, Amazon, the behemoth of the retail world.
I mean, they are a perfect example of how to apply this strategy in a really smart and strategic way. I mean, Jeff Bezos, he didn't set out to conquer the entire retail world all at once.
No, that would have been incredibly ambitious and probably foolish.
Right. Instead, he focused on specific market segments one at a time. So he started with books.
Yeah, books were a really smart choice for a number of reasons. They were relatively easy to ship and store. The demand was predictable.
Right. And once Amazon dominated the book market, they moved on to other areas like electronics, then clothing, then groceries, and on and on. They were systematically dismantling their competition one sector at a time.
And by focusing their resources and expertise on one area at a time, they were able to become the dominant player in each of those markets.
It's like they were playing a giant game of Risk, you know?
Yeah, conquering one territory at a time until they controlled the whole board.
Exactly. And it's a really great lesson for anyone who's facing a really big challenge or who has a really big ambition. Break it down into smaller steps. Don't try to do everything at once. Focus on winning those smaller battles first. And eventually those victories will add up to something much bigger.
I like that, winning those smaller battles.
Exactly. And it's, like I said before, it's about momentum. Each victory gives you more confidence, more resources, and makes you a more formidable opponent.
Yeah, you're building on your successes. using each victory as a springboard to the next.
Exactly. So let's talk a little bit about the flip side of this strategy, which is the danger of a unified opponent.
Right. So far, we've been talking about how to divide your enemies. But it's equally important to understand how to prevent your enemies from uniting against you.
Because a unified opponent, that's a whole different ballgame.
Oh, yeah, that's when things get really tough.
Right.
Because a unified opponent has so many advantages.
They've got shared resources, they can coordinate their efforts.
Right, and they have that sense of solidarity, that shared purpose that can be really powerful.
It's really inspiring, right? I mean, that's why revolutions happen. It's why social movements gain momentum. It's because people come together and they say, enough is enough. We're not going to stand for this anymore.
That's the power of unity. And it's something that you need to be very aware of if you're going to be using this divide and conquer strategy.
Because if you push too hard, if you're too obvious in your attempts to divide your opponents, it can backfire. They might see through your tactics and realize that they're stronger together.
And when that happens, you've created a much bigger problem for yourself than you had before.
Exactly. So it's all about finding that balance. You want to create enough division to prevent your opponents from uniting, but not so much that you provoke them into doing exactly that.
It's a delicate dance, you know. You need to be subtle, you need to be strategic, and you need to be adaptable.
You need to be paying attention right. You need to be reading the room, so to speak, and adjusting your approach as needed.
Exactly. Now, your sources actually have a great historical example of this whole idea of a unified opponent and the dangers that it poses. And this time, it's the British Empire in India.
Yeah, this is a fascinating example because it shows how a relatively small group of people were able to control a vast and diverse population for centuries.
Right, and a large part of their success was due to their ability to prevent a unified Indian resistance from forming.
They did this by exploiting the existing divisions within Indian society.
Right. India was, and still is, incredibly diverse, with a multitude of different religions, languages, ethnicities, and castes. And the British, they were masters at playing these groups against each other.
They would offer favors to one group, then turn around and make promises to another group, all the while making sure that these groups never fully trusted each other.
And it worked for a long time. The British were able to maintain their control over India for over 200 years, largely by keeping the Indian population divided.
I mean, it's a testament to how effective this divide and conquer strategy can be, but it's also a reminder of the potential for abuse, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's so important to use this strategy ethically, to be mindful of the consequences of your actions.
Right, because ultimately, this strategy is about power. It's about gaining an advantage over your opponent. And like any form of power, it can be used for good or for evil.
It all comes down to your intentions and your values.
And that brings us to our last historical example, which is a cautionary tale.
Okay, hit me with it.
Napoleon Bonaparte.
Napoleon, another military genius, but one who ultimately fell victim to his own ambition.
Exactly. So Napoleon, he was incredibly successful at first, conquering much of Europe, but in the process, he made a lot of enemies.
He was a bit of a bull in a china shop, wasn't he?
He was, and eventually those enemies realized that they were stronger together than they were apart.
So they put aside their differences, formed a coalition, and took him down.
Exactly. And that's the lesson here. If you try to take on too many opponents at once, if you divide and conquer too aggressively, you risk creating a situation where those opponents will band together out of sheer necessity.
And when that happens, you're in big trouble.
You're in big trouble because now you're facing a unified, determined, and very angry opponent.
And history shows us that those kinds of opponents are very hard to defeat.
So it's a really delicate balance, right? You want to divide your opponents, but you don't want to unite them. You want to be strategic and subtle in your approach, always keeping in mind the potential consequences of your actions.
And that's where the art of strategy comes in. It's not just about knowing the tactics, it's about knowing when and how to use them.
Exactly. So let's bring this back to the present day and talk about some practical steps that people can take to apply this strategy in their own lives.
Okay, so first and foremost, you need to be observant. You need to pay attention to the dynamics at play in whatever situation you're in.
Right. So if you're in a negotiation, for example, pay attention to the different parties involved. What are their interests? What are their motivations? Are there any natural alliances or rivalries that you can leverage?
Exactly. And once you've identified those dynamics, you can start to think about how to use them to your advantage.
So maybe you subtly highlight a point of disagreement between two of the other parties, or maybe you offer a concession to one party in order to create a wedge between them and another party.
Right. It's all about being subtle and strategic, always thinking a few steps ahead.
And this applies to all sorts of situations, not just negotiations. If you're working on a team project, for example, and you see that there's some tension between two of your team members.
You might be able to use that tension to your advantage.
Exactly. You might be able to subtly encourage that tension, not to the point of creating a major conflict, but just enough to keep those two team members from forming a strong alliance against you.
And in doing so, you're essentially dividing your potential opposition, which can give you more influence and control over the project.
Exactly. And another practical tip is to be patient. This strategy is not about quick wins. It's about long-term thinking. It's about playing the long game.
Right. It's about making small, incremental moves that gradually shifts the balance of power in your favor.
And remember, this strategy is not about being manipulative or unethical. It's about being strategic and clever. It's about using your understanding of human nature to your advantage.
And it's about being mindful of the consequences of your actions.
Absolutely. All right, so to wrap things up, let's bring it all back to that core message of strategy number 17, defeat them in detail.
So the key takeaway here is that you don't have to face every challenge head on. You don't have to try to conquer every obstacle all at once.
Sometimes the smartest approach is to divide and conquer, to break down those big challenges into smaller, more manageable pieces.
And in doing so, you not only increase your chances of success, but you also reduce the overall risk.
It's about being strategic. It's about being clever. It's about using your head as much as your heart.
And it's about recognizing that sometimes the best way to win is to not fight at all, but to simply outsmart your opponent.
So as you go about your day, your week, your life, think about the challenges you're facing. Think about the obstacles that are standing in your way. And ask yourself, is there a way that I can apply this divide and conquer strategy to make things a little bit easier?
Yeah, what are those natural divisions that already exist? How can I leverage those to my advantage?
Exactly. And most importantly, how can I do this in a way that's ethical and that aligns with my values?
Because at the end of the day, it's not just about winning. It's about winning the right way.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep thinking strategically, keep diving deep, and keep those minds sharp.
See you on the next deep dive.